All right, good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. We have a really good update on the Regional Rail Master Plan here tonight. We can go to the next slide and talk through the agenda. So we have project overview. We'll recap where we are, why we're approaching this project, and how we're approaching it, and then talk through a little bit about what we've learned to date so far about the existing conditions as a brief recap. Review the scenarios to level set on what we're looking at right now and the feedback that we're getting on those, and then talk through some of the updates we have on the analysis of those networks compared to the goals set in the first phase of this project. And then we'll wrap it up with a good session of the Q&A. Go to the next slide. As we go through these items, feel free to drop any questions or comments in the Q&A box or use the chat function. We'll keep an eye on that and then group our questions together for guided discussions for the last 20-25 minutes or so. The next slide. So as a reminder, we have the project team here from SEPTA. We have Jody Holton, who's the Assistant General Manager for Planning and Strategy at SEPTA. And then we have myself, Ryan Judge, the Director of Strategic Planning, and Claudia Leaf, who's a Planning Analyst with Strategic Planning. And the next slide. So we're approaching all of these major projects right now: Project Metro, Reimagining Regional Rail, and Bus Revolution, together in a cohesive way so that they build towards what we refer to as one lifestyle transit network. And what we mean by that is a transit system that can be used for all types of trips throughout the day, not just those typical 9-to-5 commute patterns. It's something that can be something that helps us make transit more useful to more people. The next slide. We're particularly focused on working with the Bus Revolution process as they're going through a similar effort to identify a preferred network for the future. And we know that our bus network and our regional rail system can be better integrated and serve more people when they work together. Go to the next slide. I'll hand it off to Christoph Spieler, who will introduce the project team you see here on the slides, and then walk us through some of the scenarios and the existing conditions analysis to recap where we are today. Christoph.
Excellent. I'm Christoph Spieler at Hewitt-Zollars. I'm the consultant team project manager for this project. We are doing this work along with Nelson Nygaard, and Adija is here today, and you will hear from her in the presentation. I'm also working with Portfolio Associates and Connect the Dots, who are both doing public outreach on this project, as well as a team of other technical consultants who are really helping us figure out how all of this will get done. Also give a shout out to Madeline, who's running our tech today from Hewitt-Zollars. So we know that regional rail works well for many riders. Over 132,000 people a day rode before the pandemic. But we also know that regional rail does not serve as many trips as it could. There are neighborhoods that the train passes through, but really is not a useful service to the people who live there. There are off-peak trips. There are all the kind of trips that Ryan described as part of the SEPTA forward plan. And we think the regional rail system can be part of that. That regional rail can be a connected part of a lifestyle network of frequent all day, all week services that connect people to a range of destinations around the region. We want to make this system more useful to more people. And that means we're working towards a vision of what that looks like. What is the future of SEPTA's regional rail system, and what are the infrastructure, the equipment, the operations, the policies that are needed to get there? We're halfway through this project right now. We started out by doing public outreach around goals for this system. Based on what we heard from you there, we developed a set of scenarios which show different ways to get to those goals. And we are now doing outreach on those scenarios. This is actually the end of round 2 of outreach. This is our final event in this round. And after we get all this public input, we're going to take it and develop one scenario, one plan for the future of regional rail. And we're going to come back to you at the end of this year with what that vision looks like. And so be waiting late this year for another round of public outreach. In our first round of public outreach, we launched a survey. We got over 5,000 responses. We hosted 7 pop-up events. We held a virtual public meeting. We analyzed and documented existing conditions. We formed a planning advisory committee. We formed a stakeholder committee. We conducted focus groups. We created and evaluated scenarios. And all of that led to the work that we're going to show you today and that we're currently getting outreach on. We learned a lot from studying the current network. This is a system which is designed for people who work 9-to-5 jobs in Center City. It is really a network that serves a ridership that is disproportionately white, wealthy male, and from households who own a car. And that if you look at this map, which actually shows which transit modes people use, you'll notice that low-income residents, people of color within the city of Philadelphia, but also in surrounding areas like Chester and Norristown, are opting to ride buses in SEPTA Metro, even when regional rail might be faster or more direct. There's clearly people who we are not serving with today's system. And when we asked in that first round what's important to people, frequency was at the top of that list. People said, if we want this system to be useful, we need more frequent service, as was integration with the rest of the overall transit system. People want better connections to buses. People want better connections to trolleys and Market Frankfurt line and Broad Street line. And based on what we heard there, we're recommending fundamental elements for what the future of regional rail service should look like. First, we heard from the public that this system is confusing. And so to make that easier, we really want to have a system which is fundamentally simpler. Today, a lot of trains skip certain stops. And so we're saying in the future, we ought to have a system where every local train makes every stop. You will not get on a train and find that train is whizzing past the station we were trying to get to. Right now, we have stations that actually have less service at peak than off peak because of this. We also want to do the same with express service where we offer it, that where we have express service, those express trains make the same stops every trip. So again, that system is easy for a first-time rider and easy for somebody who doesn't make the same trip every day. We also want to implement clock-face schedules so that if there's a train at 2:15, there's going to be another train at 3:15, there's going to be another train at 4:15, so that it is much easier to remember the schedule. And again, much easier to use the system if you ride at different times every day. And improved wayfinding. Right now, some of these stations, this is a system where you really have to be in the know to know where to wait, to know where to go. Better wayfinding makes the system more welcoming to new riders. We also know we need to make the system easier to access. We're looking at better sidewalks, better bikeway connections to stations, so it's easier for people to get to that regional rail service. And making every station accessible. Today, if you're on a wheelchair, there's large parts of this system that are not available to you. And in making the system more accessible, we're making it useful and more useful to a wide range of people. We're also looking at making the system better connected. As Ryan said, this project is being done alongside Bus Revolution, so we have the opportunity to redesign the regional rail system at the same time we're redesigning the bus network and create more connections from bus to regional rail. This map shows you how many opportunities we have to make those connections, overlaying frequent bus routes on where the regional rail lines are. And we think we can make new connections to SEPTA Metro. We can look at North Philadelphia Station, completely rebuild it, so you got better connections between all of the regional rail lines that pass through there, including the lower level lines that some of which stop at Broad Street, and tie all of this to the subway line so that you've got a full connection there. We're also looking at a connection to Radnor so that as regional rail crosses over the Norristown high-speed line, you can have direct transfers between the two modes, and 2 trolley extensions so that the end of trolley lines can reach the nearby regional rail stations. We also think making the system better connected is about fares, and that means including transfers here so that if you paid for a bus fare to get to regional rail, that bus fare is credited to you as you tap onto regional rail. And then in general, we can integrate these fares more so that the two systems can work as one coordinated, integrated network. So the public input we got has really guided the development of 3 scenarios for a long-term vision, and that long-term vision would be phased in over time. All of these really deploy the same amount of service in different ways to illustrate the trade-offs we're looking at here. These are exercises to understand the choices in front of us. In the end, the final plan maybe will likely be a combination of these. There are specific ideas in all of these which can be combined in different ways. But fundamentally, we have choices to make. We can spend our resources in different ways. All of these systems, incidentally, include more service in the current regional rail system, but they are designed that they're roughly the same amount of service. So here's the choice we have. We can run 30-minute all-day service everywhere. We can run high-frequency service where the demand is highest, or we can focus on express service for longer regional trips. So imagine you're in Doylestown, you need to go to a meeting in Center City. You're standing in front of a train that's going to get you there 55 minutes early, and you'll be sitting around doing nothing for a while. But you have to take that train because if you waited for the next train, you'd be 5 minutes late. This is what infrequent service does to people. You end up having to plan your life around transit rather than transit being there if you need it. And right now, if you look at the pre-COVID service, much of the regional rail system had a train once an hour in the middle of the day, and evening and weekend service was similar. And that puts riders in that quandary. And the way we address that in scenario 1 is to say we're going to put 30-minute service everywhere on the entire system. That means it's much more likely that there's a train that matches your schedule. You're not in that same situation. There's a reasonably convenient train available. But what it also means is that we don't get much truly frequent service. We overlap lines so that from Glenside to Penn Medicine, you get a train every 15 minutes, but that's the only part of the system that gets that kind of service. Scenario 2 goes in a different direction. We see in mapping demand that there's a large part of the system which serves areas that have demand for service that runs every 15 minutes or better. And that's not surprising because these are areas which are served by trolleys. These are areas which are served by the subway and the L. These are areas that are served by bus routes. The demand is clearly there, even if the current system isn't serving those trips. So that, for example, you're at Wissahickon and you're headed to Center City and you're getting on the bus right there. There's a train only a few blocks away. And that train would actually get you to Center City more quickly. But that train costs more. That train is hard to get to. And a lot of the riders around don't actually know how the regional rail system works. It's a little intimidating. So that's what we're focusing on here. Basically creating a new part of SEPTA Metro that uses regional rail tracks but runs like a subway. Train every 15 minutes, all day, every day. You don't even need to look at a schedule. You can just show up to the station. Fully integrated fares with bus, trolley, subway, and L. And the station platforms are all level boarding. And the trains are designed to have room for bikes and wheelchairs and strollers and luggage. So really, even though we're using the regional rail tracks, we're running a service that looks a lot more like a subway service. And that would go up to Glenside, out to Chestnut Hill East, out to Norristown, to Radnor on the Paoli-Thorndale line, out to Wawa with the new extension on the Media-Elwyn line, out to Chester on the line on the way to Wilmington, and out to the airport. And then beyond that footprint, we're looking at less frequent 30-minute and 60-minute service for the outer ends of those lines. Scenario 3 looks at speed. We know that regional rail is the fastest mode that SEPTA operates. However, if you look at off-peak on some lines, that service can be 20 minutes slower than the peak express service. So we're offering people who are traveling for a 9-to-5 job in Center City fast express service. Reverse commuters don't get that same service. People who don't work 9-to-5 don't get that same service. So right now, you may be waiting at the Trenton station, and there's your SEPTA train. It'll take you 48 minutes to get to Center City. Right next to it, there's an Amtrak train that takes only 26 minutes. But your SEPTA ticket won't work on it. What we're proposing in this scenario is to actually create a network of express service, 30 minutes all day, both ways, and to do that by integrating with Amtrak. So key stations across the system have that express service. Like I said, it's a two-way service. So it works for those reverse commutes. It works for jobs that start or end in the middle of the day or in the evening. And we do that by really combining SEPTA and Amtrak service. So if you're on the Paoli-Thorndale line, you already have the Keystone trains running there. In this scenario, those trains are more frequent, and they also take the same SEPTA key card for the same fare, which means we don't need to run SEPTA express trains. That new version of the Keystone service becomes that express service. So these three scenarios really treat the system quite differently. If you look at express and local service, in scenario one, we have an all-day express that stops at every station at rush hour. We have an express service added to that stops only at key stations and provides faster service. In scenario two, at rush hour, you have the frequent service in the core of the system, and then overlaying it, you have the less frequent regional rail service, which makes all stops on the outer segment of the line, and then during rush hour runs express to Center City. Outside of rush hour, instead of running express to Center City, that train becomes a shuttle train connecting to the outer end of the frequent service. Because the outer ends of these lines have service that is very 9 to 5 heavy, the vast majority of the riders get that direct express service to Center City, actually better service than today, but we have that all-day service with the frequent connection. And in scenario three, the service pattern actually looks the same all day because we have an all stops local overlaid with that all-day express service. Those scenarios also have different implications for the fleet. In scenario one, just like today, we need a train that can handle all of the conditions across the system. And because that train is serving long trips, it's got fewer doors than the subway train. It has more seats so that people can sit for those longer trips. And scenario three is similar. The needs for the trains in scenario three are pretty similar to today's. Mind you, we're talking about much more modern equipment. In the future, we won't be running trains from the 1970s. But in scenario two, we have an opportunity to do something different. Because we have this frequent service, we can have a dedicated fleet for the frequent service, and that fleet can be designed much more like a subway car, more doors, so it's much quicker to get on and off. We can make every station level boarding, and we can add more rooms for bikes and luggage and for people standing, which serves those shorter trips much better. We also think that every scenario will include changes to fares, but in different ways. So scenarios 1 and 3, for example, we probably have a zone system that looks more like it does today, but with a central zone that matches fares for buses and SEPTA Metro. In scenario 2, if we're really saying that these new lines we're creating are like SEPTA Metro, we probably want to expand that zone and have that frequent service be the same fare as SEPTA Metro and local bus. So as we make these decisions, we're really making the system useful for different types of trips. So imagine 3 different people. Fred is a commuter from Thorndale at rush hour. Isabella's on the same line at Paoli, but works a midday shift in University City. And Brenda is also down the line at Overbrook, but uses transit for all kinds of trips, not just work commutes. Fred does well in scenario 1. He's got nice express service to get him to Center City quickly. And scenario 2 works well here as well. There's not a significant difference here in terms of what the rush hour commute looks like. And in scenario 3, he's at one of those stations that gets that express service. So he gets that all-day express service taking him into Center City. So if you're looking at Fred, all 3 scenarios work out pretty similarly. Isabella, though, scenario 1, she has a train every 30 minutes. She'll make a transfer at 30th Street to get to Penn Medicine Station. She's got decent frequency here, but she doesn't have an express service because that train stops at every station along the way. In scenario 2, Isabella's actually one of those people who has to transfer because she's beyond the reach of the frequent service. She is making a transfer to frequent service and another transfer to frequent service. So it's not a hard transfer, it's timed, the service is frequent, but nevertheless, she's got a 3-seat ride here. On the other hand, in scenario 3, she is at one of those express stations. So she actually gets express service all day long, every day. And because she's traveling at midday, that's a big benefit to her. Brenda, on the other hand, scenario 1, her trips get a little easier. But with the train every half an hour, she really has to plan her trips around the train schedule. If you look at Brenda in scenario 2, though, suddenly she has a train every 15 minutes all day. She's not even having to look at a schedule. And all of the trips she makes, she now has fast, frequent service. And she's likely now using regional rail instead of the bus. Scenario 3, because she's riding between local stations, the express service doesn't help. She has a train every hour. And the result of that is going to be that she likely uses other transit modes. So let's hear from you. How do you think this system works best? And we should be pulling up a poll here. So do you think it's better to have trains every 15 minutes where ridership and demand support it, but every hour elsewhere, or trains every 30 minutes everywhere? And do you think it's better to have more express service that's faster but skip some stations? Or is it better to have more all-day local service? Looks like we've got a couple people still participating. It's interesting, we've done this kind of polling at multiple different meetings by now, and every meeting is a somewhat different breakdown. Give it another 30 seconds maybe, and then we will close the poll. Okay. Okay, so we have a pretty split group right here. 48% for the 15-minute service in the denser areas, 52% for 30-minute service everywhere. 47% like the express trains, 53% like the locals. And as I'm about to show you, that's not atypical on what we've seen. So let's talk about what we've heard so far in this round of outreach. We have done a whole series of different outreach activities here. We have done an online interactive tool where you can answer questions like the ones that you saw just now, up to 2,600 responses as of August 8th. We did an in-person public meeting on 5/25 and a virtual meeting on 5/18, and we've done a series of community workshops in West and North Philadelphia, Norristown, and Chester, and a series of focus groups with a specific focus on residents in areas that do not regularly ride regional rail in neighborhoods that we feel are being underserved. So far, we've heard from a good range of riders. We've definitely heard from those frequent everyday riders, but we've also heard from lots of people who ride only rarely, maybe once a month, even never. We've also heard from people all over the region. Here you can see the distribution of the survey results, and you can see that really spreads pretty much everywhere where the regional rail system goes. I'll note that if you look at the diversity of this, our sample has skewed more white than the overall area, and that's part of the reason we did focus groups to really make sure we fill in those gaps. We have very much hit the mix of people who don't own cars as well as people who do own cars. And like I mentioned, we used the community workshops to really reach people who we weren't reaching through our online survey. We found that overall awareness about regional rail is low among African Americans, especially in inner city neighborhoods, that comfort, safety, cleanliness were seen as key benefits. And that those who use regional rail are really identifying a lot of different kinds of trips at a lot of different times of day. We heard a lot about the barriers, things like fares and being able to understand the schedules. And in those focus groups, we saw a lot of support for that kind of frequent service. It's interesting when we break down our survey results by how frequently people ride. The daily riders have a tendency to prefer 30-minute service everywhere. People who aren't riding today have more of a preference for that frequent 15-minute service. And likewise, current riders like express service, whereas people who ride less frequently are really much more interested in a focus on local service. And in general, though, there is a strong preference for really focusing on some of the shorter trips, not just really the long regional ones. Also been watching which scenarios people are indicating as their preference. And what's interesting is in the online tool, we ask people questions which suggest which scenario works best for their question. A good number of people actually switch. And what that tells us is that there's really features in each of these scenarios that people really like. And that again points to the fact that the final result may be a mix of things. We've also gotten a lot of really great detailed comments about how this system works, and we're looking at all of those, and we're already seeing that those are playing a big role in our thinking about the future of this system. We've also done technical evaluation, and I will pass this on to Adija now to talk about what we learned there.
Okay. Next slide, please. So all the scenarios that Christoph just discussed involved trade-offs, and they're good at different things. Next slide, please. The scenarios were developed with 3 goals in mind, which are to increase and improve access to opportunity, prioritize an intuitive rider experience through a seamless, welcoming system, and create a reliable, predictable regional rail system that people can trust. And key performance metrics that align with these goals were used to evaluate the scenarios, and these include ridership, access, service patterns, and cost. Next slide, please. So what we found is that in particular in scenario 1, when frequencies were increased to provide 30-minute service across the system, we saw that ridership increased everywhere. But in some areas, and we saw much bigger increases in some areas. Some notable increases were seen at the outer extremity of the Lansdale-Doylestown ride, with about 700 added riders between Fortuna and Doylestown, and 8,000 additional riders on the Norristown line. Next slide, please. The areas where we saw the most increases were areas with high population density and areas with many non-traditional commuters. So meaning people who are traveling outside of peak travel times that we normally think about during rush hour. Next slide, please. Those same areas saw even more increases with 15-minute service that we would see in the metro frequency scenario. On the Chestnut Hill East line, we saw ridership that was 100. So you saw increases on the Chestnut Hill East line, Norristown line, and Media Wawa lines that were much greater than in scenario 1. Next slide, please. Another part of the evaluation that we focused on was access, so understanding how far people could go. So we looked at how far people could go within an hour from North Philadelphia station. This is a place where many regional rail lines come together, but the system doesn't currently provide much access to the rest of the network from North Philly. Next slide. So when you're looking at this map, you can see how far people can go currently in the lighter purple and how far people could go in scenario 1, which is in the darker purple. And you can see just how much more access people have with an increase in frequency. Additionally, there are benefits from improved connections at North Philadelphia Station that Christoph described before, where people can more easily transfer between different lines served at North Philadelphia. Next slide. You see a similar story in scenario 2 with more frequent metro service in areas where there's greater density. And you can see, you can go to the next slide then. And you see the same thing in scenario 3 where there's express service, and you can see at express stations there is greater access to different parts of the system. Next slide, please. Oh, could you go back one?
No.
Sorry, thank you. So what you can see is that all of our scenarios offer improvements when compared to the existing system. All three scenarios increase and improve access throughout the network, and it's supported by increased frequencies that help to facilitate improved access. There's an increase in the share of BIPOC, low income, and residents who don't own a car who ride the system. There's a reduction in vehicle miles traveled, improved access to destinations, lower travel times, improved accessibility and reliability, and it makes the system easier to understand. Next slide, please. So in scenario 1 specifically, we saw increases in ridership in suburban areas and reductions in driving. With scenario 1, we have the highest reduction in vehicle miles traveled because it's attracting longer distance commuters to trains. Additionally, we saw ridership increase in outer portions of the system due to more frequency. What it doesn't do as well is it provides less 15-minute service than scenario 2. Additionally, it doesn't benefit riders on current SEPTA bus and SEPTA Metro services. Next slide, please. Scenario 2 increases ridership the most overall. It has the highest overall ridership, it has the strongest connectivity to other SEPTA transit services, and it provides the greatest equity benefits. What it doesn't do as well is it doesn't increase ridership as much on the outer parts of the system like scenario 1 did, and it doesn't have as much of a focus on express service. Next slide, please. So if we take another look at scenario 2, you can see how it serves BIPOC and low income communities very well. Next one. And just to, I guess, provide more context, in the bolded dark black line, that's where you have the frequent service. Additionally, scenario 2 adds frequent service where we found that there is all-day demand, so where there's a greater demand for service. So these are areas that are more dense with residents and jobs. Next, please. So that demand, coupled with the increase in frequency, provided or showed that there was greater increase in ridership in the denser parts of the region in scenario 2. Next slide, please. Additionally, scenario 2 has the most frequent connections between frequent regional rail service and frequent bus connections and SEPTA Metro connections, which include the Northtown High-Speed Line, trolley lines, and the Market Frankfurt and Broad Street lines. You can see on this map where there are frequent bus connections in blue and SEPTA Metro connections in green. So scenario 3 speeds up trips, but only in some places. And what it also helps to do is it reduces redundancy between SEPTA and Amtrak by sharing express service. What it doesn't do as well is it has the least ridership increase, and it doesn't improve service at non-express stations. Next slide, please. Additionally, scenario 3 has the simplest service patterns. So today there are, if we're looking at the Paoli-Thorndale line, there are 10 service patterns on the Paoli-Thorndale line. So a service pattern is essentially a combination of stops that are served in a particular pattern. So currently there are 10. In scenario 1, there would be 3 service patterns. In scenario 2, there would be 4. And in scenario 3, there would be 2. Next slide, please. And now it's back.
Yeah. So all of these scenarios require significant capital projects. We've been very deliberate in this process to really start the discussion with service, because ultimately service is what all of you will experience on the system. And so we want to start with what is the level of service we want, and then we are going to figure out what kind of infrastructure do we need to provide that service. There's a whole range of things we need to do. High-level platforms, accessibility to the stations. There's places where we need full station reconstructions. We need new yards. If we have a new fleet, we probably need more modern yards for that fleet, but also a lot of the yards are in the wrong places right now. We don't have a yard at the Wilmington end of the system, for example. So the first train of the morning has to run without passengers in it all the way from the center of the city down to the southern end to start service. We need junction improvements. We need places to turn trains around, and we're going to need sections of double tracking. So all three scenarios require these kind of improvements. That junctions, for example, limit frequencies, and therefore they constrain schedules. We build flyovers at junctions, we can eliminate some of those conflicts. Single track segments are also a limit on frequency, and double tracking or additional sidings can address that. Where we share tracks with freight, that's also a limitation on how many trains we can run, and it makes the trains we do run less reliable. And new track could help with that. And stations that don't have a platform on every track set up conflicts. We have some cases where tracks effectively become single line because the platform's only on one track, or 4 track segments where with the outside platforms, a train has to switch to the outside track in order to stop. So we've been working through what this looks like for each of those scenarios. Here you can see scenario 1. You can see places where we need to look at track capacity, freight rail interference, places where station configurations are a limitation, turn back locations, junctions, and transfer stations. You can see adding 30-minute service, we have single track lines out to places like Doylestown, Warminster, and the outer end of the West Trenton line. We need to add some double tracking and sidings in order to make that work. We also have stations at the end of those lines which only have one station track with one station platform. We would need a second track to be able to accommodate those trains. As we get further in, same problem on Fox Chase. Also to accommodate express service, probably need some additional tracks on the trunk headed towards Center City. We have some junctions that have capacity issues. We have the station at Wayne Junction that needs an extra platform. In Trenton, we probably need a better way to turn trains. Norristown, we have freight rail interference. And we have a few new transfer stations we want to add. If you then compare that to scenario 2, the portions of scenario 2 that aren't as frequent actually end up not needing as much double tracking, but we have additional junctions that have issues, and we have places where we need to create transfer stations where the frequent service ends, and places like Chester, for example, where we need to be able to turn trains around. And then finally, in scenario 3, we also need additional tracks for express service, and we're going to need to create stations where express trains can meet and pass local trains. What these maps do not show is the station upgrades, because if we want level boarding, we want more accessible stations. That is going to be a lot of stations around the system that need this kind of work. We also, as we are going through this, have other choices we need to make. There have been proposals for a long time for extending this system outwards. SEPTA owns tracks today that could be reactivated. However, extensions are inherently a trade-off. Any money we spend on new rail service is money we don't spend on improving the current system. So that's one of the things we really have to weigh off here. We also have opportunities to add stations to current lines. Trains run nonstop through dense areas that have high demand. And that can be a really good way to add ridership to serve those surrounding neighborhoods and to create new track connections. So we're evaluating opportunities for infill stations. The benefit here is the trains are already running. So adding a station does slow the train down a little bit, add a little bit of running time, but it can serve a lot of people. And all of these scenarios involve several new connections. I mentioned those earlier again, the trolley extensions, the Radnor transfer, the North Philadelphia station. And we're also looking at if there are other connection points where we could create better connections. Ultimately, the results of this analysis are contributing, along with public input, to the process of creating the final recommendation. And we're expecting that this vision is likely a combination of these, where we're making different trade-off decisions on different lines. Ultimately, this is a long-range plan. We are being deliberately ambitious about sketching something out to say this is really the ideal system for this region. It'll take a while to get there. There's a lot of things to build there. But we also don't want to be saying to the public, wait 20 years until you see something. We think there are immediate changes that can be made here. Scheduling changes that fit the existing infrastructure. We can make changes in fare policy. And one of the things Ryan's been focusing on is there's already projects SEPTA is doing to do infrastructure upgrades along these lines. We can make sure those projects are designed for that long-term vision. If we know what the long-term vision is, we know where we're going. Then in the medium term, we can really start to implement big chunks of this vision. Right now, we have a fleet, most of which dates from the 70s. We have a chance to do new equipment. We can start doing station upgrades and infrastructure upgrades. And if we bundle those station upgrades and infrastructure upgrades together, they can directly lead to new service. So I would imagine a plan like this would end up being rolled out line by line. And then in the longer term, we believe this vision is ultimately achievable. This is the kind of thing that cities around the world and other cities in the United States have been able to do. And we think we can be ambitious and we can be optimistic for what is possible here. And with that, we'd like to answer your questions. So I will pass it on to Ryan, who has been busily looking at the questions in the chat.
So we got some good ones in there. And I think what we see in the chat emphasizes a lot of what we've heard over the past couple of months in terms of the feedback that we've received on these scenarios. What we're looking at now, and really what we're looking at as we move forward over the next couple of months, is taking all of this feedback and creating what ultimately becomes a hybrid of these scenarios. It's not an either or choice between these. We're going to take the feedback that we heard, and it was pretty clear that there's some aspects that people like about each scenario, some aspects that people really don't like or don't think would work. And we're going to take that feedback and incorporate it into one network that takes the best of what we can and pulls that forward, that ultimately finds that appropriate balance between those trade-offs. I think the poll that we had earlier pretty clearly showed the differences of opinions that we have to figure out how to work our way through. But enough of that. I think we got a lot of good questions in the chat. I'll start with one that was really about focusing less on regional rail, more about regional mobility and building systems that serve those mobility needs. And I think that we tried to talk a little bit about that at the beginning. The SEPTA Forward initiatives that we have going on right now, which are reimagining regional rail, which we're talking about tonight, Bus Revolution, which is looking at our entire bus network with a blank slate approach to identify how that network would function better for more people. And then ultimately Project Metro, which is looking at our route transit network and how that's easier to use for more people and ultimately serves them better in the long run as well. We're doing all of those items at the same time for a reason. It's not by happenstance. We're doing it at the same time so that we can coordinate all of those initiatives. So the Bus Revolution team, we released a few scenarios. There were two this spring. We went through, had a similar outreach effort to get feedback on those scenarios, identify trade-offs, and are taking that information through the summer and working through a number of workshops internally to create a preferred network. At the same time, we're taking the feedback from this regional rail effort and identifying a preferred network. Those efforts internally are coordinated right now. So we're identifying where those buses meet up with regional rail stations, what regional rail stations might make sense for a really important transfer hub as we look at capital improvements over time, how those services can be better integrated, how our policies support those as well. So we're doing this very intentionally at the same time. Christoph, I don't know if you want to add anything on that front before we move on to fares.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is the regional rail plan because ultimately, from an infrastructure standpoint, that's how it gets implemented. But this planning team from the beginning has been seeing regional rail as part of an integrated transit network. And we've also seen that transit network really integrated with walking and biking and scooters and everything else as well. That I think the biggest potential of this system is actually that integration. We're looking at scenario 2, seeing nearly more than a doubling of ridership in our projections. And a lot of that ridership is coming from better connections to other transit. And the rest of it is coming from people who are being able to walk and bike to these stations. So this is very much a multimodal plan and part of a big multimodal vision.
And that really reinforces a lot of what we've heard to date about the regional rail system being effectively off limits to people, or people viewing regional rail as something that's not for them or it doesn't serve them well. By better integrating it, we can make sure that it's more useful to more people. So there were a number of comments in the chat or questions about the fare policy. And as you can see, as we walk through that, it's a little bit undetermined at this point in time. And we identified some broad stroke potential options to work through this. but we haven't quite figured out exactly how that will look. And that's ultimately because it'll depend on the scenario that we move forward with, or the mix of the scenarios, I should say. But we know ultimately that it needs to be simpler than it is today. We have an incredible number of fare products, and it makes the system incredibly complicated to use, to understand, to pay for. It doesn't make it an attractive option for a lot of people for those reasons. So ultimately, we know it needs to be simpler. It needs to be easier to use in terms of how you pay for your trips, when you pay for your trips, how you figure out what your fare needs to be, and ultimately what those zonal breakdowns are. We have 4 zones plus the center city zone plus the New Jersey zone. It makes figuring that out very difficult, but simplifying it, we know, is the direction we want to head. And as much as we can, integrating it with transit across a footprint that we find appropriate. As we go through the next process and identify where the frequent service on regional rail is, what those limits are, and how that integrates with the transit system, that'll help determine what that zonal breakdown is. There was a couple comments in the chat about how it breaks across city boundaries or county boundaries today. Ultimately, we need to look at it as to how it works across transit system boundaries. People don't live their life by municipal boundaries. They live their life by where they want to go and when they want to get there. And ultimately, we need to design a fare system that works that way. Christoph, anything you or Adisha want to add to that?
I mean, I think there's lots of good precedents for how to do this. And one of the real advantages here, frankly, is that the SEPTA key card already works on multiple modes. So we already have the physical fare infrastructure that's shared, which allows us to program in the actual fares being a lot more integrated. We also think that it is important to make it easier to purchase fares. Right now on regional rail, you can pay cash to the conductor, or you can already have your key card, but at most stations, you can't buy a key card. You can't buy a ticket except by boarding and paying the conductor. And so making fares easier to purchase, I think, is also one of the real opportunities here.
All right, so we had a couple comments about first and last mile station connections. So we noted earlier in this, when we were walking through the goals and the objectives of the scenarios that are consistent, about the need to work with our partners across the region to make sure that the land use is developed in an area around the station that truly supports the type of investment that we're talking about, and that those first mile, last mile connections to and from the stations and the destinations that exist are safe, so that you can walk there and bike there. That's a huge part of seeing this project as more than just a SEPTA effort, but truly a regional effort to make sure that our mobility needs are met across a variety of modes and not just looking at any one thing in isolation. Christoph, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're absolutely looking at this. We're absolutely looking at this together.
So there are a couple comments about infrastructure, not surprisingly. 15-minute service frequency clearly creates more crossings at grade. So it was noted to look at the potential for collisions and the upgrades that might be necessary at those at-grade crossings. This is something that our peers have looked at in a variety of regions. Long Island Railroad has done some work to grade separate a couple of lines so that they can provide more frequent service without the concern over the at-grade crossings and collisions that would be associated with those. So that's something that, as we look towards the next phase of this project and the infrastructure side of this conversation, we'll be identifying where those grade crossings would be most impacted by additional service and what we need to do on that front.
Yeah, and I would add to that, one of the advantages we have is we actually have significant sections of fully grade separated lines. In some cases, there are pedestrian crossings at stations, which station improvements could address, but we actually have a lot of the infrastructure and many fewer at grade crossings than a lot of other systems do. And I think there's also a lot of upgrades you can make to a crossing to make it safer, even without grade separating it. Better 4-quadrant gates. You can really make some improvements to those crossings to make them safer.
So Christoph, I think this question might be directed towards you. There's a comment about implementing the improvements either line by line or phasing it in over time, and how, if you do it line by line, if you need to commit to pairs, at least semi-permanently, to coordinate with the through running. I know you've had some thoughts. We've had some discussions about that.
Yep. No, I think through running is one of the great things about the system, the fact that trains can run into one side of Center City and come out the other. Right now, trains pair through the system, but the pairings vary dramatically over the course of the day so that you really can't count on them to understand how the system works, that one of your trains may be going to Norristown, another train on the same lines going to Doylestown. I think that part of making the system easier to understand is to make those pairings fixed so that the two sides of the system, the lines always line up in the same way and say, if one airport train goes to Norristown, every airport train goes to Norristown. And that is something we can start implementing early. And as noted, it's something you probably don't want to shift over time. This is the advantage of that long-term vision, where if we know what the system wants to look like in 30 years, we can make sure to start running it that way. And that might also indicate some of the phasing of the improvements. I'll note that that idea of bundling is really important because, for example, if you have the airport line where there's only one station that doesn't have high platforms, the trains that run on that line have to be physically equipped for low platforms, and they have to be staffed for low platforms. The assistant conductors have to be there to be able to open the doors. If every station on a line has high platforms, that allows us to buy simpler equipment. It allows us to have smaller crews. And these upgrading entire line can also take care of a lot of state of good repair issues at the same time and really allow you to immediately see more dramatic service in a way that a single station by station upgrade wouldn't.
There's a question just came in about identifying parking lots that can be redeveloped. And there's a part of this effort where we'll be looking at station typologies to identify what type of investment in the area around those stations make the most sense. That'll support some efforts we have underway for our transit supportive community development program that's identifying where SEPTA can be a partner with our local communities in achieving their development goals, and to make sure that the land around our stations and around these investments are truly used in a transit supportive way. There's also a comment about increasing the actual speed of trains. There's a variety of areas across our system where the trains, when you're riding in them, they feel like they're just slogging along. There's a couple of slow points that we've identified through this that we can identify for speeding up those trips. We know that combined with frequency of service is ultimately what makes transit the most competitive and the most useful option for people.
Yeah.
Christoph, anything on that?
And I'll note that the other speed issue is actually platforms. That right now, especially at rush hour, the time it takes for people to get on and off the train significantly slows this down. One of our conclusions of looking at some of these is we actually think we can make future local service faster than today's express service in some cases. And the great thing about that is it's not just good for the riders, it makes the service cheaper to operate, which means we can actually operate more service. So those kind of speed improvements, I think, are absolutely part of this. Junctions are another part of that. Improved junctions can actually cut a couple minutes out of a trip in some cases.
There's a comment in here about policy headways and not demand headways, and how we're approaching the service level concepts here. And I think that it's a bit misleading. The way that we're looking at it is a combination of demand, existing demand, the ridership that we saw pre-COVID, the ridership that we see today, in addition to what we're referring to as latent demand, which is based on the land use around these stations, the population density, the job density, and the general destinations in that area, what we see as the potential for growth of ridership. So we're approaching it from a demand perspective, but from a more holistic demand approach, not just the ridership that we see today, but the ridership that we think we should see on these lines, that ultimately by making this service more useful, that we'll see that ridership over time. That's the same approach that we're taking as we go through the bus network redesign effort. We're looking at the same sort of metrics, the same sort of analysis, that we're taking a regional approach to identify where that mobility demand is and where we think we can be the most useful to most people. How we apply that ultimately comes in those service level policies.
And I'll say, I mean, the comment was absolutely right in that obviously we have large parts of the system where the demand at peak will be higher than off peak. I would imagine that in many cases the trains will be longer at peak, which is exactly what they are today. And these frequencies we're talking about in the end are minimum frequencies, and you may add some additional rush hour service slotted into there. But I'll say what we're doing here is suggesting a fundamental change in how we think about frequency. I think in the past, frequency was seen as a form of capacity. You run trains more often when the trains are more crowded to make the trains less crowded. And when the trains are less crowded, you run them less often. But the problem with that is it really makes the system less useful. And what we're really trying to do here is treat frequency as a promise, to say to you, you're going to have a train every 15 minutes all day long. And it doesn't make sense to say that the 2:17 train isn't that busy, so let's just have a random half-hour gap in the middle of the day. Because as soon as you do that, riders don't count on the service. So that's why we're approaching this as a minimum all-day frequency, because that's essentially a promise to riders of what level of service they can count on whenever they're traveling. But the capacity is important, and regardless of what we do, ensuring that the capacity is there and the peak matters. But in that way, we're thinking about it much more like a subway service and less like a regional rail service.
There's a comment in here about the Chestnut Hill West line being proposed for discontinuing, and that's not in any of the proposals right now. So just want to make that clear that there are no lines that we're proposing to discontinue. They all maintain a level of service. What that service looks like is ultimately what we're trying to determine through this effort. There's also a question about the Radnor station, which I think is a really good example about how we're looking at integrating all of these various modes together. So for those of you familiar, the Norristown High-Speed line passes directly under the Paoli-Thorndale station, Paoli-Thorndale line in Radnor. So there's the Radnor station on the Norristown High-Speed line that's about a quarter mile to a half-mile walk from the Radnor station on the Paoli-Thorndale line. These two lines are incredibly important parts of our system and a huge opportunity to fully integrate them together. But right now, they quite literally pass by each other without serving one another. We don't know exactly what that solution needs to look at, but we know that better integration between those two stations is a huge part of better integrating our network. So we'll be looking at that as we get into the infrastructure side of these conversations. There's a couple other examples like that we see throughout our system. There's the potential extension of the trolley to Eastwick, a few other areas where the trolley network crosses over the regional rail system, and the Market Frankfurt line crossing over the regional rail system as well. There are a number of comments about the integration with New Jersey Transit at Trenton and points south in Delaware, as well as general integration with Amtrak. That's something that we heard a lot about between all of these, between all of the scenario feedback that we've gotten, is the importance of integration across these modes. People generally don't care who's operating it. They just want to be able to use transit that's useful to them. Christoph, anything you want to add on what we've heard to date?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, New Jersey Transit runs into 30th Street. I would love to see a greater integration of that service with SEPTA service. And that, you know, ultimately having a world where schedules are coordinated and fares are shared. I think one of the things I love about this plan is that SEPTA actually has the ambition to suggest some things that are beyond SEPTA's power. With the kind of integration we're showing in scenario 3 is not a decision SEPTA can make by itself, but we are very deliberately suggesting that here's an opportunity to integrate more. And I think you can absolutely take that thought beyond this footprint. I think there's a way to operate the entire Northeast corridor in which we could actually carry a great deal more people a lot more efficiently than we do today, which would have huge sustainability benefits, take people off the highways, take people off the airplanes. Like from a national transportation policy level, that kind of integration could actually make for a much more useful network that carries a lot more people. And so that's a really important discussion to have. This plan's only a small part of that discussion, but I see a lot of opportunities in terms of how regional rail integrates. I see people have mentioned PATCO. Like PATCO in a lot of ways is like a regional rail line, just operated by a different agency. Thinking about how that connects to the rest of the system, I think is a real opportunity as well. Yeah,
that's absolutely right. So we're just about out of time here. I know there's a couple good examples about that integration between other systems. I see Sound Transit's Rail Plus program reference. There's a couple not too far from us in Mark. There's some examples in Connecticut. There's a variety of examples across the Northeast that we're looking at as well. There were a couple of comments about the input process and the feedback process and getting a broad regional input to make sure that both city and suburban stakeholders are at the table and the decision makers from across the region are involved. We've absolutely been working with people that represent the entire region. There's various working groups behind the scenes that involve stakeholders from our suburban counties, from our city departments, and leadership at each of those organizations as well. So we make sure that everybody's involved in this process and truly buying into the vision that we're creating. And it's not a vision that just serves one group and forgets another. It's something that truly serves our entire region as we move forward. So with that, we're just about out of time. We will make this presentation in a PDF format online, and we'll also have this recording available online over the next couple weeks and months. Please keep an eye out for more information. And for those of you that want to stay up to date, you can check out the project website at regionalrailplan.com to sign up for the emails, and we'll keep you abreast as opportunities come along to get involved and show your support for this project. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.